He thought he was safe inside his own home, surrounded by the walls he worked his whole life to build. But in an instant, safety shattered. A knock at the door turned into flashing badges, raised voices, and threats that didn't feel real. They weren't police, but they wanted him gone, just because of the color of his skin. What started as intimidation would spiral into something far darker, and when the truth came out, it shook an entire community. But this was only the beginning, because what showed up next would change everything. Calvin was a man of quiet routines. He had worked hard to buy his little cabin by the lake, a place where peace finally felt possible. His days were simple: morning jogs, evenings spent fixing small projects, and weekends hosting barbecues for friends who were more like family. To him, this home wasn't just property, it was proof that his struggle, his service, and his sacrifices meant something. But peace is fragile when the world sees you through the wrong lens. Calvin had grown used to the stares, the whispers, the unspoken question of whether he truly belonged. Still, nothing could have prepared him for the night when strangers would show up at his door, waving papers and flashing fake authority, determined to drive him out. He thought he had found a safe haven. But the real storm was about to begin. The first knock at Calvin's door was firm, almost commanding. At first, he thought it was a delivery or a neighbor, but the voices that followed carried something colder. When he opened the door, 3 men stood there, badges glinting under the porch light, uniforms that didn't quite look right, and expressions that carried more hostility than authority. They called themselves HOA enforcement, claiming he was in violation of neighborhood rules. Calvin had lived there for years, and he knew the HOA well. These weren't them. Still, they carried themselves with the swagger of men who thought their word was law. They pushed papers into his hands, printed notices filled with threats of fines, eviction, even jail. He scanned them quickly and saw the errors, the misspellings, the official-sounding language that meant nothing. It was all fake, but the way they looked at him made it clear. This wasn't about paperwork. This was about power. Calvin felt his chest tighten. He had faced intimidation before, but never in his own home. The so-called officers circled around his porch, one shining a flashlight through his windows, another taking pictures. They muttered things under their breath, words like trespassing and squatter, as if the home he had worked for, the one he legally owned, didn't belong to him at all, as if his skin erased the proof of ownership. He tried to stay calm, standing tall in the doorway. Every instinct told him not to give them an inch, but they kept pressing. One leaned close, voice sharp with a threat. If Calvin didn't pack up and leave, things could get ugly. Another pulled out zip ties from his belt, letting them dangle in the air, as if daring him to resist. The night air grew heavier. Calvin's mind raced. Was this really happening? Was his home about to be stolen under the guise of false authority? He thought about calling the police, but what if they believed the imposters first? He thought about arguing, but what good were words against men who came armed with lies and intimidation? For the first time in years, fear crept into his safe haven. He could feel his pulse thundering in his ears. The porch light buzzed above them, throwing harsh shadows across faces that wore smug certainty. And then one of the men reached for his doorknob, trying to push his way inside. Calvin's hand shot out, slamming the door shut. His voice, steady but low, told them this was his property, his home, and they had no right to enter. The men laughed, mocking his defiance. They didn't back away. They only grew bolder, pounding on the door now, rattling it on its hinges. To them, he was alone, outnumbered, and powerless. But they didn't know Calvin's story. They didn't know that the friends he kept closest weren't just neighbors or co-workers. They were men who had served alongside him, men who had trained for moments when intimidation crossed into danger. Inside, Calvin reached for his phone, not to call the local police, not to dial 911, but to send a single message to a private group, a message only 5 words long. Within minutes, headlights cut through the night, tires crunching on gravel. The fake officers froze, their arrogance faltering as shadows stepped out of the vehicles, 6 figures, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and silent. These weren't imposters. These were Navy SEALs, Calvin's brothers, his family in arms, and they had arrived with the kind of presence that made predators think twice. The porch went silent. The fake enforcers exchanged nervous glances, their swagger crumbling. For the first time that night, it was clear the power had shifted, but what came next would push the standoff into its breaking point, and no one on that porch was ready for how it would end. The porch was no longer just Calvin's front step. It had become a battlefield of power and fear. The fake officers squared their shoulders, trying to hold on to authority they no longer had, but the 6 men behind Calvin moved with the quiet confidence of those who had faced real danger. Still, the imposters weren't ready to back down. One reached for his belt, pulling a baton with a sharp snap, while another barked that Calvin was under arrest. In that instant, time seemed to slow. Calvin stood between 2 worlds, the safety he had built and the storm that threatened to tear it apart. His heart hammered, but his resolve was steady. He wasn't leaving. Not this time. One of the men lunged forward, pounding on the door so hard the frame shook. The SEALs stepped in front of Calvin, a wall of unflinching strength. Voices clashed in the night, threats from the imposters, warnings from Calvin's brothers. For neighbors peeking from behind curtains, it was chaos. But for Calvin, it was clarity. He saw the truth laid bare. These men didn't care about rules, laws, or rights. They cared about control, and in their eyes, his very existence was the violation. The tension cracked like lightning when one imposter reached for what looked like a weapon. In seconds, the SEALs moved, swift, controlled, no wasted motion. Hands gripped wrists, weapons clattered to the ground, and the false authority that had terrorized Calvin was stripped away under the harsh light of reality. The imposters who had strutted with arrogance now stumbled, restrained, their masks of power shattered. But the true weight of the moment didn't come from the takedown. It came from the silence that followed. Calvin stood on his porch, chest heaving, staring at the men who tried to erase his place in the world. For years he had lived with the question of whether his home, his peace, his life could be taken in an instant. And tonight, he had his answer. The danger had been real. The hatred had been real. But so was his strength. So was the brotherhood that refused to let him stand alone. As blue and red lights finally painted the street and real officers arrived, the neighbors stepped out from the shadows, phones in hand, eyes wide. For the first time, the lies couldn't hide. The world was watching, and the truth was undeniable. Yet even as the imposters were led away, Calvin knew the fight wasn't over. Because the real battle wasn't just on his porch, it was in every place where injustice waits in silence. And the question lingered in the night air. If this could happen to him in his own home, how many others have faced it with no one to stand beside them? When the last of the imposters was taken away in handcuffs, Calvin finally stepped back into his home. The silence felt heavy, not peaceful. Every corner of the cabin carried the echo of what had just happened. He was safe, yes, but the fear they tried to plant in him lingered like smoke after a fire. His porch, once a place of rest, had been turned into a stage where his very right to exist was challenged. Yet as he sat inside, surrounded by his brothers who had refused to let him face it alone, Calvin understood something deeper. This night wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about fake badges or a failed eviction. It was about a reality that millions live every day, The reality of being treated as an intruder in your own space, of having your belonging questioned simply because of your skin. The community would remember what they saw. Phones had captured the truth. Neighbors had witnessed the lies crumble, and for once, the mask of authority had been stripped away in plain sight. But for Calvin, the lesson was sharper. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he earned, there would always be those who saw him as less. And that knowledge cut deeper than any knock at the door. Still, he chose not to be broken by it. He chose to tell his story because silence only feeds the cycle. His voice, his survival, his defiance, those were acts of resistance. And maybe, just maybe, his story could spark change in someone listening. Because the truth is simple. This wasn't just Calvin's fight, it's ours. And the question left behind is one we can't ignore. How many more porches, how many more lives, before we finally decide enough is enough?